Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History Guy podcast. And today I'm joined by professors Richard Horsley and Tom Thatcher. And today's discussion is based on their book, John, Jesus, and the Renewal of Israel. The link to purchase the book will be in the description below and it'll be in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Richard and Tom, thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you. Love
Hey,
your
John.
channel,
Thank
and
you.
thanks to everybody for listening.
Yeah.
Thank you both. And to start us off, how do you both begin the process of reclaiming John as a source for Jesus?
Go ahead, Tom.
You want me to go first, or you go
You,
first?
you got me into this, yeah.
So I'll tell you how I begin, but I got to warn you and everybody that Professor Horsley doesn't necessarily know what I'm going to say, and he may radically disagree with any or all of it, man. As is so often the case, and he can correct me later. So feel free to correct me now or later, man, as we're going through. As far as beginning the process, there's a long story behind this for me how I got into this, but for me the process of looking at the Gospel of John as a source for Jesus begins really with dropping, like, first of all, just dropping the assumption that goes all the way back to very early in church history, first, second century, where the Gospel of John was sort of viewed as like a spiritual supplement or the spiritual gospel to the Synoptic Gospels because it's so much more overtly Christological. And so it was always treated as a well, just say sort of like a mystical commentary on Jesus, while the others were more historical. And so, and I think an important realization you saw in this branch of scholarship late into last century and definitely in the last few decades is, and even before that, that they're all spiritual gospels. Every one of them has a theological and Christological agenda that it's pursuing. And so it's really a question of like comparing more apples to apples than treating this one as something that's odd or out of place. And actually, Dick, do you want to comment on that before I say anything else, or maybe not? Don't say that you did.
No, finish, and then I'll tell you.
Well, and so once you've made that, and this is what I really benefited the most from my interactions with Professor Horsley and others who before me had begun to look at the Gospels more as whole stories of Jesus rather than like sort of random assemblages of all these little pieces of information. Once you look at this as a coherent story of who Jesus is and what he did, I get, for me, the way I would describe it is the process for me involves less looking at all the individual pieces and more trying to align the narrative world behind the Gospel of John with the real world of Jesus and looking for points of, verisimilitude or difference. And when I say the narrative world, I mean the world inside the text, like Middle Earth is the world of Lord of the Rings, or Hogwarts is the world of Harry Potter. Every story spins up a world inside of it where characters interact in certain places in certain ways. And for me, the breakthrough kind of came with looking at it from that angle, that you can see ways that perhaps the narrative world of the Gospel of John aligns with or doesn't align with what we think the real world of Jesus was, as we can construct that. And one informs the other in a more helpful way, rather than saying I'm gonna pick this saying out or this story out and compare it to whatever Mark said or we think Thomas said and try to make it work like that. For me, that was how the breakthrough started, was just looking at that way. But sir, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Jacob, I came at this as one who'd already been working on the historical Jesus for, I guess, then decades. And it was just amazing to me that people working on the historical Jesus didn't bother with the context, with the historical context. And the other thing that was bothersome is uh, after long generations, centuries of Bible reading, people were zeroed in on particular verses. And same happened with historical Jesus study. They were focused on individual sayings of Jesus. They didn't even pay attention to the overall gospel. Now, out of dissatisfaction with that approach, I came to this sort of late in my career in the 1990s, realizing that the Gospels were whole stories, sustained stories about Jesus' ministry. And that gave it an opportunity to come at this historical Jesus fellow with a whole different perspective, not from individual verses looking for Jesus's teaching, but a whole story that might then correlate with the with what we're learning about the historical context of Jesus. And when Tom came to me and says, "Hey, try your crack at using John," that's the way I came at it. Already having worked with Mark, having worked with Q, and so forth, then I looked at the Gospel of John and wondering what to my eyes should appear, but a whole different thing than I had been raised and trained to deal with, as Tom pointed out, a spiritual gospel. And all of a sudden, I saw underneath that spiritual overlay, I saw a narrative of that had a historical verisimilitude with the historical context of Jesus as we know it from other sources such as the Jewish historian Josephus.
What was the fundamental division in ancient Palestine under Roman rule?
Wow.
Yeah.
You want to start with that? You got time? Yeah.
Question dear to my heart. Just something I've been hammering away at from, I guess, from the first book I wrote coming out of graduate school back in the 60s, 70s, and then eventually most of these essays were in the early 80s. And that is, if you read Josephus, which is an amazing source for us, volume after volume of history of the Jewish people at this very time, Josephus talks about many popular movements. And when I was working on those, it occurred to me that some of these popular movements fit two particular patterns, both of which arose out of Israelite tradition. Now, those movements were movements of villagers. Now, never before had anybody in New Testament said, wait a minute, there's different classes here. There are the rulers and the ruled. It was always just an undifferentiated group of Judeans or Jews. So this was new information to me, and I tried to lay this out. Now, the field didn't go for this. I think it's been slow to recognize this, but was his soul Tom and a few other younger scholars saw this. The whole overall Roman world looks somewhat like this. There's the emperor and the imperial court on top, and then they appoint local indigenous rulers, in this case, the high priest or King Herod, to be the rulers of particular areas. And then they have staff, and some of these staff were scribes that were the intellectuals of the piece. And then everybody else, about 90 to 95%, were villagers or peasants out in the countryside. And those people were charged with giving up their tithes and offerings to the high priest, and the high priest also collected the Roman tribute. So you can see that there's a political and an economic dimension to this, not just a religious dimension to this, where you've got really a class division between the rulers and the ruled. I've been using that rather than upper class or lower class, but the rulers and the ruled was really the way it broke down. And in the Gospel of John, we see that again and again in episode after episode, that there's this distinction.
One of the things, Jacob, that Professor Horsley particularly, and then other scholars brought to my attention, and just the attention of the discipline, I think, in the 90s and early 2000s, and even earlier, was, like you said, there's in any colonial imperial society, you basically have two classes. Is that right to say so? You have the ruling class, and then that's 1%, and the 99% who are basically serving under that system or fueling that system by providing labor and work to what becomes an economy that's always pushing money out to the center of the empire. And I don't know if I almost said particularly insidious, what would be particularly a distinctive, right, in the context of Roman Palestine is that when the Romans came, they used the Jewish or Judean religious ruling class, right, sir, as their interface with the majority of the population. And just because the Judean and the people were already used to looking to those people as sort of a bonding agent in their society. Unfortunately, I would say unfortunately, that created a very difficult religious political interface where the same people who are maintaining us, who are supposed to be providing me with religious and pastoral, or whatever you want to call it, care and insight, are also representing the interests of a colonial power. And what you see particularly in the Gospels, and really in the Gospel of John, man, more than the others, is
Right.
centered around the temple, particularly, and the people who controlled it. Over and over again, you see, and then of course later in the later decades, when this all turned from just I say just from protest to like overt violent revolt twice, the temple was a significant center point for that, both symbolically and even militarily, as people were trying to recapture that. That you were going to comment, sir.
When Herod rebuilt the temple,
Right.
massively rebuilt the temple, it was then a fortress. It was the only place in
Yeah.
Judea, Galilee, Samaria, where peasants could go and hope that they could defend themselves against the onslaught of the Roman legions.
Yeah. So you have, Jake, to your question, in this context, you really almost have like a third level where you have the main division is going between the Roman overlords and the masses of the people, but between them, this I guess religious leadership that is kind of mediating that from one to the other. It just creates a recipe for uh radicalization, I guess you'd say, which is what we see happening in Josephus and eventually to some extent in the Gospels as well.
Who are the Northern Israelites, and is there a connection between the stories we are told about them and what John's Gospel tells us about Jesus?
Jacob, I think to answer that, we should start historically. Um, uh, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, with all the stories, legends, and so forth. Um, there were supposedly 12 tribes of the people of Israel. Now, they never really got together at any particular time, but in the early days, they were called to defend each other from invasions such as the Philistines and so forth. Now, uh, the way the Old Testament story goes, the Hebrew Bible story goes, they all uh, uh, came together in Messiahing the young David as their Messiah, as their king. But then they rebelled against David when he tried to set up a monarchy over them. He conquered the non-Israelite city of Jerusalem, which was really a Jebusite city, and this is the kind of passages that my Old Testament teachers never assigned, but they're right there in the book of Second Samuel and so forth. The Israelites, all 12 tribes at first, and then later on the northern tribes, the 10 tribes, rebelled against the Davidic monarchy. And of course, we know the story of when under Jeroboam, the 10 northern tribes rebelled and set up the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, in the very north, Issachar, Zebulun, there were 3 tribes up in the area that eventually came to be known as Galilee. And they were initially under the kingdom of Israel, headquartered in Samaria. But when the Assyrians conquered Samaria, then that left the 3 northern tribes alone up there, and they were for decades, for generations, under a separate imperial division, a separate province of an empire. Now, it wasn't until the Hasmoneans took over Jerusalem, took over the high priesthood, that the Hasmoneans with mercenary troops then took over Galilee. That wasn't until 104 BCE, so it was roughly 100 years before the lifetime of Jesus. Now that puts a whole different picture, whole different frame on the situation that when you come to it in Jesus' ministry, that the Galileans have been under Jerusalem rule for only about a century. And then because the Romans set up Herod Antipas, the son of Herod, as the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, then the Galileans during the lifetime of Jesus were no longer under Jerusalem rule. Now, this leaves us scholars with something to try to figure out is to what extent was Jesus a Jew? I would say probably not, but Jesus was certainly an Israelite, and the Israelites in the very northern tribes shared tradition with the Israelites in Judea and the Israelites in Samaria. I don't know if that sets up a picture historically, but they would all be Israelites. But the only the ones in Judea itself were properly Judeans, or as we translate that, Jews.
What were the tensions between the Samaritans and the Israelites about? And is the connection with their conflict with first century CE events and the Gospel of John?
Yeah,
Um,
again, Tom, let me start with that, and then you chime in. Um, 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 the those Hasmoneans I spoke of. Now, the Hasmoneans were the same as the Maccabees. So Judas's brothers were the ones that took over the high priesthood after the Maccabean revolt. Um, uh, the sons and grandsons, or maybe the grandsons and great grandsons of Judas the Maccabee, or the grandnephews, they hired mercenaries and they conquered Samaria and destroyed the Samaritan temple. Now, that happened only in the mid late second century, so that just less than 2 centuries before Jesus, the Judean high priests had conquered and destroyed conquered Samaria, the Samaritans, and destroyed their temple. Now, goodness, that's going to be the roots of some pretty hard feelings between the Samaritans and the Judeans. Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
no, well, and Jake, of course, you should chime in too, man, because you are expert on this stuff as well. For me, it's actually hard to get a clear. You're talking about how those tensions play into what we see in the Gospel of John, especially in like the most famous Samaritan story in the Bible is John 4, where Jesus meets the woman at the well and he's traveling through Samaria, going back and forth, and seems to be, and John the Baptist is baptizing people in Samaria in the Gospel of John, which is quite different than, well, different than what we see in the Synoptics, right? Um, it's in my mind, and Dick may disagree, there's not a super clean logical line from like what you see described in the Hebrew Bible about the division of the tribes to exactly what we see happening in the New Testament. Because when you look at the beginning point of that, to me, the story that's there about Solomon's son, King Rehoboam, uh, there's the union leaders come to him and say, "Hey, we'd like to have a little bit easier time and not have to work so hard for so little." And he comes back and says, "Hey, you're going to get it twice as bad you ever got," and that created this rift. And now you have two kingdoms. To me, that makes sense. That kind of stuff happens. And when you get to like the story of the Good Samaritan in the Gospels, ethnic religious hatred happens, and you can kind of see that that's there for me, Dick, like the pathway Josephus and that try to draw between those 2 points isn't as clean. And to me, I think that's because, like you just alluded to, so there was so much just ongoing, at least violence, I guess you'd say hatred too, between these two groups, and where it all emerged from is not 100% clean. What intrigues me though, and Dick, I'd be interested. I haven't talked about this for a long time. What you see happen in that story in John 4 about the Samaritan woman at the well where Jesus sits down and he tells her she's had five husbands and all this stuff is actually kind of an interesting take because on what was in my mind probably the real problem there, or at least the sociological problem there. Um, they have different sacred places. You have this group of people is not the Samaritan group, the northern group, is not affiliated and probably never affiliated themselves with the temple in Jerusalem. Like
Yeah,
that's the thing all the way back to the beginning. So when Jesus goes over to Samaria in that famous story, where he meets this woman is at a place called Shechem, which is the place, if you look back into the biblical collective memory, like and I think in the Samaritan Pentateuch as well, but definitely there, but in the Hebrew Bible as well. That's the place where Abraham built his first altar. That's where Jacob put his
Jacob.
well, which is where they're sitting. They believe Joseph's tomb was up there on the hillside. If you look the other direction, is the spot where they believed when Joshua came into the promised land, he made the famous "Be strong and courageous" speech. So if you remember that story at all, when Jesus goes there and he sits down by the well and starts engaging with this woman, the question she puts to him is, our fathers worshiped on this mountain, but you people say Jerusalem is the place we have to go to worship. Well, the reason she said that is the whole collective memory of that space was our our fathers, the patriarchs, were here. And you people later on came up with this idea that we had to go down to your place and build your temple, which, as Professor just said, and in the when dude, this is a critical horizon for all this for me. And the time we're talking about, the Jerusalem temple was, well, some say arguably was the largest public building in the Roman world. There's almost nothing comparable to it. I don't even know today, sir, if there's any comparison. The billions of dollars of money and time and energy, the entire economy is built around this thing. So a lot of that conflict to me was not just around different religious preferences. I think the Samaritans probably had an idea that there is no reason. Why should we have to divert from our older traditional ways that are tied to, for them, to the patriarchs, as she claims there, rather than paying all this money and time and energy for you all to have this thing that becomes the primary economic engine that puts you in bed with Rome, and to go even further. So I think you have underneath the on the popular level, it ends up looking like religious hatred or quote racial hatred. To me, there are some other very significant economic issues going on there. And I don't know that the Samaritans are the obvious bad guys in that. I think there was a lot there was a lot on both sides of that, that there's more to the story than what we see. I don't know if you agree with that or not. I don't think I've ever told you about that.
The Judeans in Jerusalem in that temple were the bad guys. For
Well,
the
yeah, I mean, well, Jesus kind of says that, right? So, and that, to what you just said before about how that connects, Jacob, with the whole thing with the Northern Israelites and the in the what you do see in John's Gospel, since that's kind of our topic, it's, am I right about this? It's really the only one
Yeah, the only
that
one.
shows Jesus and John the Baptist actually being active in that area as well,
Yeah,
which and I'm sure Dick will talk about this in a minute, ties into this larger, what I think we would see as Jesus' larger prophetic vision for some kind of a, I almost said a reunification, so a unification of all of these people together again. I almost said reunification because, like you said, they were never really unified in the first place, but a bringing together of groups of people who had who would have thought they had a common Israelite religious heritage, but had been divided for centuries by. Is that fair to say, sir? That kind of renewal is what he's.
yeah, centuries. Yeah, yeah. Jacob.
What is the Q source, and what does the series of speeches contained within it tell us?
Yeah, the Q. This is more and more in my mind a little bit slippery, but let's fill in the what's been in the field.
Yeah.
When the scholars were trying to figure out the relations between the Gospels, they could see that Matthew, Mark, and Luke had many of the stories, the episodes in common, and it was thought that Matthew and Luke must have copied or used Mark. So Mark is the source for Matthew and Luke. Now, Matthew and Luke then have a lot of teaching material, a lot of Jesus' teachings that are not in Mark. And goodness, but almost 2 centuries ago, scholars came up with the idea that there was a second source. Now, Q is short for Quilla, which in German means source. And since everybody was reading these as individual verses in the King James or in the Luther Bible in German, they came up with this name, the Synoptic Sayings source. So the Q then was short for the Synoptic saying source. Now I want to fast forward to my own work in disagreement with the Q scholars. I was kind of like the loyal dissenting member of that seminar, and I was pointing out all the time, look, these aren't just separate sayings; these are really speeches on particular topics. So one of the largest speech is what we call the Sermon on the Plain or the Sermon on the Mount. Then there's also a mission speech, and there's other speeches that are on particular topics of interest to a community. So I think the thinking now, I think I can speak for other Q scholars, is that the Q was a set of sayings or speeches used by one of the branches of the Jesus movement, probably in Galilee. And now the agreement divides. Others would say they're sayings. I would say that they're speeches, and the speeches are on particular topics. Some of the same topics or issues are covered in Mark and elsewhere in Matthew and Luke. So I don't know if that helps you see, helps for what is Q. Many New Testament scholars don't believe in it for a minute. And people like Tom and me who have gotten in touch with the research on communications media would say that Q as well as Mark were probably performed. They weren't originally written. They were somehow developed by repeating speeches, and then at some point where we have a distinctive structure of Q, that then kind of stuck. And it was at that point that Matthew and Luke must have used this set of speeches, and then Matthew and Luke each adapt them in each in his or her own way. Well, I shouldn't say his or her, because we'll maybe later come how were the Gospels composed. They weren't composed in writing by particular writers. They were developed in communities, probably by repeating the stories, repeating the episodes, and eventually those came to form a story that we know then as the Gospel stories.
Why can we not reconstruct Jesus as an individual from his interaction with others in historical context, but including his interaction from the movements that produced and performed the Gospels?
Why can we not do that, you're asking? Like, why is that?
Yeah, I'll take it. Okay. Let me just back up in historical Jesus work in the last 40, 50 years, and maybe just back up to the 80s and 90s, where the Jesus Seminar, this would be a good example. The Jesus Seminar picked up on the most critical scholarship that had been developed by earlier generations, what was called form criticism, that zeroed in on each particular saying, or in some cases a combination of sayings, and tried to establish the earliest or the most original form of those sayings. And the way they did that to establish the original or the authentic ones, sayings of Jesus, was by certain criteria, the criteria of multiple attestation, that there were multiple versions of these sayings, or the criterion of dissimilarity, that Jesus' sayings would be dissimilar from contemporary Jewish teachings. Now, the problem with this is those criteria and isolating on the sayings. And younger generations now have attacked those criteria, saying these are no longer believable. We just can't do it this way. I was objecting to this because I can't imagine that we could construct, say, Abraham Lincoln by separating Lincoln's separate sayings out of his speeches. No, there must have been speeches there. And who are we to separate on particular sayings and saying that's the real Abraham Lincoln? Well, the same would be true with Jesus. Jesus would have interacted with the disciples and others, and in the interaction, that would determine what was remembered or not. And in communication, you don't communicate in isolated sayings. You communicate in more of a context and in particular topics. Now, let me give an example. um, Jesus scholars that I'm arguing against would separate every verse in the Sermon on the Plain or every verse, parallel verse in the Sermon on the Mount. I look at that Sermon on the Plain, Sermon on the Mount, and I see a structure that resembles very much the covenant structure in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible passages on the covenant God made with Israel. And then with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see the Dead Sea community produced a community rule that starts with a covenant that has three components: the declaration of deliverance, all about how we got delivered to the point we're at now, the demands that God makes on the community, thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not steal, no other gods before me, don't bow down and serve other gods. And then finally, to sort of have a sanction on everything, there are blessings and curses. Blessed are we if we do this, and we'll be cursed if we don't do this. Now, there's perhaps the best example of a speech. We can see the structure of that speech. And that's what we have now in our Gospels. We can't go behind that. We can't go do anything with those individual sayings. We have to start with those speeches and those memories of communities of what they remember as significant from their interaction with Jesus. I choose all of those words, all of those phrases very carefully, what they remembered from their interaction with Jesus. And then those memories of that interaction were then developed at some point separately by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or Matthew, I should say Mark, Q, Matthew, Luke, and John. Now, Tom and I want to say John as well.
As well, yeah. Jacob, to the second part of your question, and again, this is as Dick just laid out, this is different from the older traditional model of this of Jesus research was that somehow there's this somewhere down in there you could find like, here is something he actually said or he actually did, and then these four people and maybe Paul or whoever too, or Thomas, pick that up and put it into their thing. And so they tended to view like a gospel, whether if something like Q or Thomas is saying gospel or a narrative gospel, as like a mosaic made out of all these tiles, right? And so the goal was, we're going to crack the mosaic apart, and this one tile would be that came from Jesus, and this one didn't, and this one came from here. The larger issue for me that raises is that approach raises is and this ties it, like Dick said, this is all about thinking about this from the perspective of real human beings actually communicating something that they believed about the past. Okay, not us today looking at print books or digital texts that are manufactured and highly regularized and put out there for anybody to consume the way we do now, but as real living interactions between people. And the deeper question and actually what I'm about to say is not intended to mean we can't know anything about Jesus. It's intended to say what it means to say that we would know something about the historical Jesus. Okay, so I want to straight that. But the larger question is whether any kind of historical discourse, from academic stuff like this book all the way down to some woman telling her boyfriend what happened at work yesterday. Okay. The question is whether any talk about the past is ever truly objective in some kind of a sense that I don't have an interest in what happened back then. And what I would argue is, if we don't have an interest in what happened, we ain't talking about it. So the fundamental challenge when you try to extract this one thing, we take this one story, this one saying from John, from Matthew, from Mark, from the Q body of material, and there's all kinds of overlaps too, but even between John and Q, there's at least a dozen overlaps that look like there's talking about the same thing or something similar or similar event. To say that you can separate that saying or that incident from the total story that person is trying to tell, from the communications context in which whoever these people were talking to other people about something that mattered to them deeply that happened in the past, right? that's just a level of objectivity that doesn't exist anywhere. It doesn't exist today
No,
in
no.
the publication world and the academic world. And when I turn on the news and I see why is this happening in Iran in April of 2026, as if anyone has nobody has a dispassionate interest in that stuff. So whenever we're talking about the past, even our personal past, even our personal quote personal memories, there's always this social dimension where I'm trying to explain something to you or relate to you, or do something meaningful, say something meaningful to me, or persuade you to do something. John says overtly what all of them assume, which is, I'm writing this stuff so that you'll have life in Jesus' name. Well, once I start with that and I'm trying to communicate that to you, okay, it's not so much that that's going to change everything I say, it's that everything I say is in service of that and contextualized toward that. And so to say that, well, we're just going to ignore all of that and somehow come back to some, I don't know, Dick, the way you're not going to get anything Jesus said or did without that. There's no way to, if you took out all of the motivations of the people who preserve this material for us, and you said, I want to subtract all of their motives and theological perspectives and desires out of it and just have the piece that goes back to Jesus, there would be nothing left. And I would also say, if you went back, because the first part of your question was why we would say you can't take Jesus out of his historical context. If Jesus wasn't always interacting with his historical context, nothing he did would have meant anything to anybody then anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So it's always, it's just basically to say that, like the professor said before, the way it's not like this stuff was there and then they told these stories. They were telling these stories the day after Jesus did anything anywhere. And so what we're seeing in our gospels now is just like a maybe a more fully developed form of that not many people wrote gospels. So we got there's four narrative gospels we know of, right, sir? And they all happen to be in our New Testament today. But it's that idea that you can somehow pull this apart and somewhere down there is something that's untouched by anybody's that's actually what gives history power and relevance. It doesn't reduce it. And so that's why we would be contending that you're better off to try to say, okay, rather than looking at all of the trees, what's the forest look like? And how does that forest look like what we would think a person who was the kind of person we think Jesus was would have acted or spoken to his own contemporaries decades before any of this stuff got written down. Am I right about that, sir? Am I totally
Yeah,
off on?
good, good, Tom.
He taught me well on that. So yeah.
What are the three interrelated fundamental features of a story that help us understand the historical story of Jesus better?
Tom, you go ahead because you're the literary man in the.
Well, so the ones you're referring to, and this is and I find this helpful too. Dick's saying this, but he really kind of introduced this model to gospel studies. There's many features to analyzing a story or a narrative, right? But the three that are most helpful we find to this kind of research are looking at the setting, which can be the physical setting, the temporal setting, the world, the stage, basically, man. If you're thinking about a film or a play, like what's the stage? What's there? Where is this happening? So you have this physical space where there's something happening on a certain day or time. That's one thing to look at. Another is the characters that are on the stage, like who is there and who are they and how are they interacting and what kind of relationships exist between them. So if Jesus is talking to a Samaritan woman, or if he's talking to this guy Nicodemus, who's supposedly a member of the Jewish ruling class, or if any two things are interacting, like who are these people and what are they doing? And then the third is the plot, which is like what is happening, like that, and usually in a cause and effect relationship, although less so obviously in ancient eras than today, like what's going on between these people in that space. And that's what we were alluding to earlier is you you may not ever, if you take the approach that we're going to look at those three things in the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Mark, even like Q, to the extent that it spins up a world around itself that you can see Jesus and other people interacting and speaking into. How does that align with the world we see presented by Josephus, by the Dead Sea Scrolls, by archaeological, just by that world we can do there. And any one of those points of analysis, like looking at the settings and the symbolism around spaces and times, looking at the characters, who they are and how they're interacting, looking at the events and who's doing what to who, where, how, all of that can be really fruitful for not just understanding these stories, but even understanding Jesus himself, who is also an actor in a real world that he's doing there. So again, it becomes a matter of, okay, and you can never, and for me, it's never so much a thing as saying, well, this is true or false. It's more, here's what we think this world was. Here's how it's portrayed in Mark. How do we see analogies between the two that help us better understand both, right? Is that fair to say, sort of that piece, or
Yeah.
go deeper than that?
Jacob, let's take it back to where you started us with that first question, and let's try to pull together the setting, the characters, and the plot. Um, um, the setting in Judea, Galilee, under the rule of Rome, and especially Galilee in the Gospel of Mark, maybe especially Judea in the Gospel of John, where Jesus spent so much time in activity. Now, the characters, the high priests are the rulers of in Jerusalem. Herod Antipas, ruler in Galilee, but he doesn't play that much of a role. The Pharisees working for the high priests in Jerusalem. Now the characters and the setting are given in the historical setting that we know from other texts and sources, such as Josephus. Then let's come to the interaction, to the plot. We started this conversation with the interaction between the rulers and the ruled. So now we have in the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Mark, and so forth, we have similar interaction between the rulers and the ruled. Now, all of this says to me, we're looking at Gospels here that fit the historical setting and give us a tremendous start on the historical Jesus and interaction with the people he interacted with and interaction with the rulers, especially the high priests and then the Roman governor.
Yes.
What does the Gospel of John say about the fundamental divide between the rulers and the people?
Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, the fundamental divide. So I'm not sure if this is let me sort of walk in. And Jacob Bowen, man, if we're not saying anything that's right or helpful, you tell us, because this is your show. And you know if this makes any sense or not to all the people out there that will listen to this, right? So let me approach that this. Say your question again, and then I'll kind of back into it.
Sure. What does the Gospel of John say about the fundamental divide between the rulers and the people?
Okay, so I would say it this way, and then Professor Horsley can correct me. So one of the things that's distinctive about John's Gospel has been noted for a long, long time, and anybody who read it could see this, is he likes to locate, and this is part of his compositional type, he likes to locate everything Jesus did or said at a specific place and a specific time, way, way more in the synoptics than the synoptics do. And this is why in John, you don't get as much of this this stuff you'll see in Mark, where it's like, and immediately he went and did this and then did this. Or Luke will be like, well, one day he was walking up the road and they saw a tree and some guy asked him about the tree and he said, and it's just kind of thrown out there like a very vague type of thing. John likes to say he was in the temple at the Portico of Solomon at the Feast of Dedication, and it was winter and he was walking around, and he's like that. He tends to locate stuff in real specific times and play. And he also likes to give these long narratives about a very few things that Jesus did, like his big signs that he did. So he'll go into great detail about that, and he'll just skip to the next one. But between all of that, if you look in the little side notes between those big famous stories that end up in the stained glass windows, right? There's all kinds of allusions to, well, he was doing many other signs when he was in Judea. He was going through all the Judean villages. He was traveling from Judea back to Galilee through Samaria and passing through the villages, and then there's this, right? There's all these kind of references that kind of show him traveling around, engaging a lot of different people in a lot of different locations. That is there. John alludes to it over and over again. He's going all over the place, spending time everywhere. We just don't know what he did or said in a lot of those contexts. So you get this overall idea that Jesus does travel around and do a lot of different things, but he also does some really big ticket famous things where he'll give a long speech or he'll do some kind of a incredible healing or whatever. And what I would just note to you all, whatever you think about whether or how this connects to other sources of the Jesus of history, okay? The main points of interest are usually around attacks on what Dick has taught me and others to view as the great tradition of Judea. So, for example, um, he goes to like the two real famous healings at Siloam and Bethesda, the healing of the lame man at Bethesda and the blind guy at Siloam, okay, that are narrated in great, great detail. Like the whole chapters are given to both of those, right? Well, those are two purification pools in Jerusalem. The pilgrims to the temple, you go to wash yourself to become ritually clean so that you can go up into the temple to worship, okay? Both of those stories, Jesus goes to a purification pool on the Sabbath and heals someone in a way that would make the Pharisees and the chief priests, right, think he purposefully broke the Sabbath. Okay. Then on other occasions, a lot of his and this is where a lot of the historical Jesus scholars have gotten hung up on him saying stuff like "I'm the light of the world" and all of this, and it's like, well, real Jesus never would have. I mean, whether he did that or not is a different question, but he never would have said it. Well, it's where he says it. He says it in the temple courts. He is always, what you see in John is Jesus continually hanging around the masses of people and a lot of times going up to Jerusalem to do highly symbolic things that are forms of protest, honestly, overtly sometimes forms of protest. Going up to the temple and saying, tear this thing down, I'll build another one in 3 days. Because I don't need this anyway. You guys need this. I can go do what I'm doing out in the street. But you all need to spend $10 billion on this thing. Go ahead and do it. And so what I say this in reference to the fundamental divide. And for me, this is what, when you go back to the beginning of this conversation, man, what this really unlocked about what John tells us about Jesus, I think, Dick, I think even more explicit than the synoptics. In John, Jesus is clearly not a member of the scribal class. He probably doesn't know how to read. He's portrayed as a prophet, as a healer. He's a miracle worker. You know, he doesn't debate citing scripture in his debates. He's like a riddler. Like he'll throw out some kind of impossible saying that outwits the Pharisees, and they're like, "You're an idiot. What are you talking about?" But the people love it because he's got an answer to those. His credentials are the credentials of a prophetic uh, miracle working type of person, a healing type of person. So whenever he goes up to do these things in Jerusalem, including at the very end when he ends up getting killed over it, he emerges to me really clearly as like a populist prophet who is going against what he views as a very oppressive great tradition. And for me, that's go back to what you said before. The whole story of what Jesus does in John is played out in the side of this fundamental divide between the masses of people and the very few scribal elites that control the temple and therefore the money that's all tied into the faith tradition. Dick, I don't know if you think that's totally wrong or half right or none right or whatever, but that to me that's what that looks like. Even the way Jesus is portrayed in that story looks like what I would think a person like Jesus would look like to people like the Pharisees and Sadducees in that world, man.
Um, what strikes me is, and this what really hit me between the eyes about the Gospel of John when I read it through 2, 3, 4 times, Um, the backbone of the spine of the plot is Jesus from up north. This prophet from up north
Right.
goes south to Jerusalem for a festival of the Judeans. For a festival of
Yeah.
the Judeans. Like he's a country bumpkin going down there, and
Yeah, man.
he takes the initiative in attacking the high priests or attacking something they stand for. Now let's just take the first trip to Jerusalem for the Passover of the Judeans, and then the last one, which is another trip to Jerusalem for the Passover of the Judeans. In the first one, it's about the temple, and Jesus walks in and throws things around, and then he says to the Judeans, to the high priests and so forth, who are running the show, "Destroy this temple, you guys. Destroy this temple, and I will rebuild it." So forth. Now we don't usually read it that way, but that's the way it reads. Jump to the chapter 11, 12. There, he's gathered such a following, including among the Judeans,
Yeah.
that the high priests and the Pharisees decide to call a council. They got to figure out what to do about this guy. This guy is about to round up everybody in loyalty to him, and that panics the high priest and the Pharisees, who of course then lay a plot. And the famous words of Caiaphas, the high priest, it's expedient that one guy die for the whole people. That is, Jesus is going to die on the cross. Now, those are cases where here's the country bumpkin, the prophet from up north, being the provocateur, challenging the rulers in the south, in Jerusalem, and the rulers in the south then responding either to try to stone him or eventually to crucify him. That's a pretty clear rulers versus ruled dichotomy.
I think that if I can build on that too, real quick, I'm thinking about this, Jacob. You inviting us to do this has made me rethink a lot of this recently. So thank you for that, man, sincerely. But Dick, one of the things that's interesting about, in my mind, it's always seemed that the fourth gospel has the best explanation of why the Jewish authorities need Jesus dead or want him dead, and that John alone has that thing in the council where, well, and this might be my own cynicism aligns with John's cynicism and Dick influencing me in that, but the way John portrays this is the council comes together, which are going to be the chief priests, the families that control that in the temple, and then some of the leading Pharisees who are going to be maybe more attached to the masses out in the villages and things like that, and also in places like Jerusalem, possibly. But Dick, I don't know if if you're going to mention, I don't know, the really famous story that precedes that one in John chapter 11 is the raising of Lazarus from the dead.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Jacob, bro, I don't know if you or anybody watching or listening to this believes that people can be raised from the dead or Jesus raised people from the dead. But I'll tell you what everybody can believe. If you do that out in a village 6 miles out of town, and the people of power back in town, okay, get word that there's a rumor that this hillbilly raises people from the dead, you got a problem that you got to fix right now, because that is going to end one way when this is leading up to the Passover, where you have tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people pouring in from the countryside against, I don't know, Dick, a Roman garrison of maybe a few thousand people trying to control this mess where they're
sitting on top of the
temple.
Yeah.
And you're going to have hundreds of thousands of people pouring in from the countryside to celebrate God's deliverance of their ancestors from the Egyptian oppressors. And then you hear that this cat out here in some country village raised the guy from the dead. It don't matter whether he can raise people from the dead or not. That's what Caiaphas says. They're debating about it right in that scene, man. And Caiaphas, who is not just the priest, he's tied to the high priestly godfather family. Okay, that what Annas and his sons had 5 high priests, all came out of the same family, right? Is that correct? So it's 5 of them, right? Or either sons or sons-in-law of him. So now you have this guy saying, you guys don't, what are you guys talking about? This, we're not talking about how you're going to deal with this religious thing. We're talking about the reality that the threat this presents. And to me, that's, again, I don't know. Again, that's an example, man, of the verisimilitude thing. What I see portrayed about chief priestly families in Josephus, and really mainly in Josephus, right there. That's kind of how they would have reacted to that type of a that type of
Absolutely.
a threat, because that's what was really at stake. Not just for them personally, out of a genuine concern to protect the Jewish people, the Judean people, and protect the temple from when they know what's going to happen if a guy like Jesus goes too far.
Yeah. Um, uh, Jacob, I want to, uh, before we go any further, I want to make sure that the way we're talking doesn't sound as though we're anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic.
Absolutely not.
This is
Yeah,
something,
man.
again,
This is
something that just was to me was an amazing discovery about the Gospel of John, but it fit with what else I was discovering. Let me go back to the the discovery that that the Hasmonean high priests had not just conquered the Samaritans, but then taken over Galilee only 100 years before the lifetime of Jesus, and then they controlled
yeah.
Galilee with garrison fortresses. So it was really sort of like an occupying government in Galilee. Now, in the Gospel of John, there's a clear division between Galilee, Samaria, and Judea, and then Transjordan while we're at it. Jesus
Yeah.
works in all of those areas, all of those territories
Yeah,
of
man.
Palestine. And they're all Israelite territories. These are all Israelite peoples. But in reality, in addition to Herod Antipas being the ruler up in Galilee, the high priests were the rulers in Jerusalem, and they ruled Judea and Samaria and the Transjordan. Well, I'm sorry, part of the Transjordan ruled by Herod Antipas in Galilee. Now, what's unusual about the Gospel of John? Well, let me pause once again. Go back to the Gospel of Mark. Um, uh, some of our colleagues were saying, "Oh, there's a Jewish side in Galilee, and there's a Gentile side across the lake." No, that was not the case, because the people in Galilee were Galileans. They weren't Jews, and the Jews didn't control Galilee at the time of Jesus. Now, if you read Josephus, Josephus almost always distinguishes between the Judeans in the south, the Samaritans just north of the Judeans, and the Galileans up north. Now let's go back to the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is unusual in it. Jesus goes to villages and works with Judeans in Judea. But when he goes up to Jerusalem, where there's a festival of the Judeans, and when we get into chapters 7, 8, where Jesus is in conflict with the high priests and the Pharisees, there the Judeans seems to mean something more specific. It's the Judean rulers, or the rulers of the Judeans,
Yeah.
and those seem to be a combination of the high priests and the Pharisees, the leading Pharisees. Now, this is disputed, and most people reading the Gospel of John have not seen this, and the result is that they translate the Judeans always as the Jews, and that has led to what I think is a misreading of the Gospel of John. And what we're proposing is a more sophisticated or more careful reading of the Gospel of John, where there's sometimes Judeans who are in villages, and then there are Judeans in Jerusalem who are not high priests and Pharisees, and then there's the rulers in Jerusalem, and those are the high priests and Pharisees, and sometimes those are in conflict with other Jerusalemites. So
Right.
it's a complex situation, but Jesus was attacking the Judeans, or the rulers of the Judeans, and he was ministering among the Judeans who are in the villages. That's what I want to make sure we're not misunderstood.
Well said, sir. Yeah.
Jacob.
What is the difference between the treatment of Pilate in Matthew and John's Gospels regarding the trial of Jesus, and is John's Gospel closer to Josephus's account?
Go ahead, John. I mean, Tom.
You mean Jacob, like how Pilate is portrayed by Josephus? Like does the Josephus and John look more like
Matthew
the
and John, yeah, yeah.
the
Yeah,
one?
and Matthew.
Um, well, Dick, I'll let you comment on that too more broadly because I think Josephus obviously, and this is important to note with him too, because his portrayal of Pilate is, in my opinion, and Dick's more expertly, is consistent with his thesis that and what looks to me like Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian's thesis, that one of the reasons you get to a full-scale revolt in the late 60s is you have this whole series of really bad, insensitive Roman governors, right, that are just
Yeah,
continually misunderstanding the very unique social religious dynamic, right, that's going on that they're trying to deal with that you wouldn't necessarily face in other
yeah,
areas. And so Josephus has no great love of Pilate, and he, right, would you say so? He vilifies Pilate every chance he can to say the guy never really understood Jewish sensitivities. He steals out of the temple and he does stuff. He puts images where people don't like him. That's just sort of what's there in the right. Am I saying that right, sir? In the backdrop of that is part of that presentation.
yeah. Um,
Okay.
Jacob, I think um, not just Matthew, but Mark, um,
Yeah.
the portrayal of Pilate as relatively benign. It
Right.
just doesn't fit how Josephus portrays Pilate. And in John, we see a portrayal that is much closer to that of Josephus.
Yeah.
Um, and in fact, uh, almost Pilate is just playing with the Judean high priests. He's just
Yes.
playing with them, and the Judean high priests sort of reveal themselves to be sycophants. uh, so it's just a different kind of portrayal, and it it seems like uh, then John is much closer to Josephus, but when Matthew and Luke, Matthew and Mark really just don't fit historically from what we know from Josephus.
What's really interesting to me about John's portrayal of it is the way that back to what we said before, like the whole settings, characters, plot, the way that Pilate interacts with the Judean authorities
Yeah,
in
yeah,
that story is and the way actually they're trying to leverage him, and it becomes obvious to me at least as the thing progresses. Pilate
yeah,
couldn't care less about Jesus, and
yeah,
Caiaphas and those guys probably don't either. It's basically becomes a game of like, what's the most I can get out of you in this situation, so
yeah,
that it comes around to famously, and of course, John the Evangelist has this, the whole story climaxes with the Judean high priest saying, "Hey, we have no king but Caesar." All right, but when you look at what's going on there in that interplay where they're basically threatening him that, you know, we've already told you we see this guy's dangerous. And, Passover's not a good time for the Roman governors. Like many of the major Roman acts of protest or massacres or we're going to burn half the city down right often happens at Passover, right, Dick? If you look at that period from Herod the Great up until the first Jewish war, that's a very hot time. So it doesn't take much leverage for me if I'm one of the chief priests who wants this guy out of the way to push Pilate toward like this would not be a good idea for you to let this guy go. And that I see that they end up so I guess what you do see him doing there, like you would see in Josephus, is trying to irrationally resist them as much as he possibly can. But Pilate has a lot at stake in this too. When you try to lure him into some kind of a power game where I don't know why you want this, or I do know why you want it, but I don't want you to have it just because you want it,
yeah,
because I've got to maintain whatever some authority I have over you and those people. And what I see them doing in John is threatening him that if if this gets out of control, man, and half this city gets torn down, we're not sure how we're going to help you explain this to the people back up the chain. But the one thing I wanted to say about say about that in reference to your question And Dick, I don't know if we've ever talked about this before. To me, there's a curious little note though in Matthew's gospel too, if you take the same approach where Dick, I'm right, isn't it Matthew that says when that Pilate saw that a riot was starting?
Yeah,
So he handed Jesus over, which is basically the same tactic, right? Where I would see either one of those is saying kind of the Jewish authorities or the Jerusalem, the Judean authorities are saying,
yeah.
hey man, something really, this whole half this town might get torn down if you don't go along with this. And he capitulates. You know what I
Mark,
mean? That's a cool little note about the riot, I think, is a very
Mark,
parallel type of thing.
Mark has, if there's sort of a riot in Jerusalem, Mark has the crowd stirred up by the high priest.
Yes,
Matthew doesn't have that. Matthew has
that's right. Yeah.
well, like the whole people, and this has always puzzled me. And I don't know what I think about Matthew there, but that's the way Matthew portrays it. Well, we say Matthew portrays it. The story of Matthew, Matthew,
Right.
the Matthean story,
How it's in that.
does it that way. Yeah, yeah, Jacob. Yeah.
What does John's gospel say about the conflict between the Jerusalem elite and ordinary Israelites? And is that contest portrayed differently in Q, Luke, and Matthew?
Dick, I want to let you do this because you know more about the Q and
Yeah,
Luke's
yeah.
side
You can see the conflict between the Jerusalem rulers.
and everyday people, like the peasant masses, man, you mean, Jacob?
Yeah,
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 and ordinary Israelites, yes.
yeah. Okay, okay. Um,
Is it portrayed differently? Man, that's a
yeah.
good question.
And John, more than the other Gospels, um, I think, uh, portrays a gulf between the, the people in all of these territories and all of these districts living in villages. And it's interesting that this is true even in John. Uh, Jesus is more or less when he's ministering outside Jerusalem, he's in villages, Galilee, Samaria, even at the well, that's still a rural area, and in the Transjordan and in Judea. Now, the other Gospels, it's much more focused on in Galilee,
Yeah.
and there you don't have a conflict with the high priests really face to face until Jesus goes up to Jerusalem at the Passover time to confront the high priest, to confront the rulers, the rulers of Israel, who are then basically in Jerusalem. Elsewhere, Jesus is off in the villages doing healings and exorcisms and teaching. And in Mark, it's more he's across the frontiers into villages in Tyre and Sidon, Caesarea Philippi, and the Decapolis. So you don't see the conflict between the rulers and the villagers. You just don't see it as much. But boy, when Jesus marched up into Jerusalem, there you see the conflict, and there you see this is in Mark as well, and in Matthew. The high priests are afraid of the people who are gathered in Jerusalem for the festival. They are afraid. That's why they don't act to arrest Jesus right away. They say, "Don't do it now, or there'll be a riot. There'll be trouble." So it's clear. There's a clear divide, but there isn't much interaction, and there isn't much particular portrayal. Now, having said that, let me make one exception. In the Q speeches and in other speeches within Jesus that Jesus is giving, Jesus comes up with prophetic sayings against the high priests in no uncertain terms. He's calling down God's condemnation for their exploitation of the people. Now there's a clear sense of Jesus is speaking to a sympathetic audience when he's uttering those prophetic sayings, and it's about those Jerusalem rulers who are at a distance. If he's saying this up in Galilee, but when he gets to Jerusalem, he's saying it to their face, and of course, then he has hell to pay. He's going to get martyred for having said those things.
Yeah, it's probably not so much. It's like Dick said, it is portrayed differently, but it's partly because, like in John, there's so much more of it. Like he's
Yeah,
engaging the Jerusalem
yeah,
authorities so much more often and so much more explicitly. Because in Mark and in the Synoptics, you only got like less than a week for him to be up there doing down there doing anything, right?
yeah, yeah,
So there isn't as much occasion
yeah,
for that to happen as explicitly as you do. When Johnny's down there going up there, up to Jerusalem all the time. And every single time, without fail, he gets into it with those people. So it's much more persistent, much more actually too, I will say that I don't know, Dick, I don't think this is different or not. One of the things, but I don't know if enough about what's going on in Martin if it's different. It's the
right.
same. In I will say that in John's gospel, they're not coming to Jesus. He's going to them. Like he is intentionally portrayed doing stuff to get them upset. Like the one that comes to my mind all
Yeah,
the time
yeah,
is the story at Bethesda, the healing at Bethesda, where he goes in there and that's right across the street from the temple complex, right? That's the purification pool that's literally across the road. You can go there today. It's across the road and then walk back across the street and go in. And you're supposed to wash yourself to go in, be clean before you go into the holy temple complex. And the way that that story is told in John, and you don't know the trick until the end. He goes in there, he looks around for this guy that's been crippled for 38 years. And the guy doesn't even really want to be healed or ask to be healed. It's like that's another thing in John. You don't have to have faith for Jesus to heal you. He heals you if he feels like it. He finds this guy that's laying there. He grabs him and says, "Pick up your bed and walk out of here." And then he tells us that happened on Sabbath. John says, "Well, and it so happened that that day was the Sabbath." So then the Pharisees are coming after this guy for carrying his bed on the sit. Well, that's not like Jesus went and did some random act of kindness and they came and got upset about it. That is, he's picked a time and a place that were deeply symbolic and went straight at him, knowing that that was going to produce. I don't know if you see. I guess the temple incident in all the Gospels kind of does that, but that's just it's over and over and over again in John that he's doing that, man.
yeah.
What are the views that both Mark's story and Q have in common regarding Jesus' mission?
These are great questions, man.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Sure. Okay. um,
His mission.
uh, yeah, I'd start with how different the material is, how different
Yeah.
work is, the story, episode after episode after episode, episodes that build on one another, but they're episodes, and in some cases, they're episodes that develop. For example, in chapter 10, develop a kind of covenant speech if you put back to back the dialogue that Jesus is having with the disciples, with the rich young ruler, again with the disciples, and so forth. And in Q, it's all speech material. It's one speech after another, and each speech is on a particular issue or a particular topic. Now, how, with that disparate material, can there be similarities and differences? Here's an example of the same issues in the two. As I mentioned in Mark 10, a series of dialogues are all about covenantal issues, and the dialogues quote the commandments. In the first one about marriage and divorce, he quotes the commandment about adultery. In the one about the rich fellow, he quotes the second half of the Decalogue. He quotes virtually every covet, steal, false witness, so forth. In Q, the first and largest speech is a covenant renewal speech. I mentioned that before. And this fits the pattern of covenants with the declaration of deliverance and then the demand or the commandments and then the blessings and curses. And it parallels what goes on in the Dead Sea Scrolls, except, of course, that's a scribal and priestly group, not a peasant group. And it parallels what we see in Joshua 24 and Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Those are all covenant passages in the Hebrew Bible. Now, then there's parallel mission speeches. Jesus sending out the disciples 2 by 2 to extend his mission in healings, exorcisms, and preaching the kingdom. In Mark, that's in chapter 6. In Q, that's in what's now chapter 10 of the Gospel of Luke. So there's those very similar kind of things, same topics, basically the same gist of the speech, but different styles. In one case, a speech, in the other case, a set of dialogues. Now, in Mark, Jesus is going consistently into villages and even into the assemblies of villages, the synagogues or assemblies of villages. In Luke, in Q, it doesn't say that explicitly, but you can tell that's where Jesus is. For example, in the covenant speech, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom, and so forth. And then he goes into love your enemies, do good, and the parallel sayings are all about people who are desperately poor, and they've made loans to each other. And now the people who gave the loan is desperate to feed his kids. So he wants to reclaim the loan, but Jesus is saying, don't do it. Keep giving, because this is what's required in the covenant. Now, that doesn't happen except in the village community. That's not happening up among the high priests or among the Pharisees and scribes. That's happening in villages. And other instances, for example, in the speech in Luke 12, let's see, the one that ends, seek first the kingdom, and all these things will be added. It's poor people who are desperate for food, desperate for housing. That's happening in the villages. So there we have the parallel, the same thing going on in the two Gospels. Now, let's jump to the end of both. In Mark, Jesus goes up to Jerusalem and just lambasts the high priest with one, with a demonstration in the temple, then a parable of the tenants that is aimed at the high priest, and so forth. In the Q set of speeches, Jesus does a lament over Jerusalem as if it's already been punished by God. It's already been, has become desolate. So there's the same basic material of the gospel. There's exorcisms, healings, covenant renewal, mission discourse. Here's an example of how I think we can proceed to construct a historical Jesus out of the gospel stories and the gospel speeches. And there's so much parallel material that we can judge from that. This must be how Jesus proceeded in his mission and the extension of that mission by the apostles. Now, having said how those two are similar, then Matthew and Luke are different because of the prologue. Both of them have prologues where they tie the story in with this fellow was the Messiah, not just the prophet portrayed in the episodes in the main part of the gospel. Oh, by the way, there's something else similar between Mark and Q. Jesus is portrayed as a prophet. Now, he's also portrayed as a prophet in Luke and Matthew in the mission part of the gospel. But Matthew and Luke extend it back to the infancy stories and the genealogy and the story of the birth, which has Jesus be born as the Messiah. So there's the similarity between all the Gospels and one of the key differences that Matthew and Luke display. And that also extends the implication, the significance of this mission to Judea that John has, and in Luke to the Roman Empire, which the Gospel of Mark which the book of Acts then extends into the mission of the apostles.
What is the difference between where Jesus carries out his mission in Mark's gospel in contrast to John's?
Between where he carries on his mission.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead,
Well,
Tom.
no, we kind of commented on that before, like I may be missing what you're after 2 minutes. The similarity would be that he spends in both of them a lot of time with out in the villages, across Judea, Samaria. He's in Galilee, he's everywhere. So he's doing things all around that you also see in Mark. The main difference that comes to my mind to your immediate question, Jacob, is that because Mark's gospel is so bound to he doesn't get to Jerusalem till like the last week of his life in the Gospel of Mark. So necessarily a lot more of what Mark is talking about is happening up north, because then he has Jesus come down at the end. And so there's no space to put all these confrontations that you have with that. Dick, I was thinking about, I was actually going to ask you, sir, on this connection. Is it right to say he's asking about the difference between where he carries out his mission in Mark and John? Obviously, in both of them, he's out in the villages and things like that. And in John, he's way more often down in Jerusalem itself. But would you say it's true? I'm trying to, as I was reflecting on that question, is Mark maybe more, I don't know how you would define, more open to maybe to Jesus crossing outside the boundaries of Israel, I guess, because in John he doesn't really do that. He goes to Samaria, right. But not outside.
In Mark, Jesus is going across the frontiers to the villages of Tyre. It's always to other villages, but
right.
And I would say that probably gives us a clue to where the Markan community then continued in the villages and towns of the southern Syria. Now, Jesus is carrying out his mission, yes, in villages here and there, but primarily he's gone up to Jerusalem for a particular festival, and then, as Tom's been explaining, he's just lambasting. He's causing an issue and creating an issue with the high priests and Pharisees, and so all of a sudden his mission takes on a different character. It's not just carrying on a mission in villages to all the different territories of Israelites, but it's very much against the Jerusalem rulers. And what this suggests to me is that the Johannine story, the Johannine community, and the story are based primarily in Judea. And so that the face-off is specifically to the Judeans who are in the villages, and maybe some of them in Jerusalem, and the Judean rulers, the high priests and the Pharisees. And here's then the possibility that we have one of the Jesus movements, or a branch of the Jesus movement, that really was most at home in Judea. Sure, it's a Galilean who's the prophet, who comes in and causes a ruckus and does the face-off and is the Messiah and so forth. But it's now focused on Judea and the division between the rulers and the ruled in Judea.
Do you see, man, though, in Mark, is he more open to going outside the boundaries of Israel entirely?
Yes.
Yes,
yes, and no. Yes, and
more,
no. I see all these gospels.
Yeah.
The story is about the renewal of Israel. Now, Israel is in all of these areas, and so a particular group could be focused on a particular area. And what I see going on in Mark, and this would be with the Syrophoenician woman, would be the example of this. By the way, Jacob, all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, something which dawned on me a few years ago. uh, Most of our sources for why there's a conflict between Jews and Gentiles, between Israelites and other peoples in the Roman world, our sources are sources, or not even our sources, but are coming from scholarly construction of the Pharisees. That it comes from elite division, and the Pharisees and other scribes are very concerned about purity, keeping all the sacred temple pure. Um, uh, Peasants, whether they're Galileans or Judeans or Syrians or others, they have a lot more in common than we think. So peasants in Syria or Assyrian villages would find Jesus's message of the renewal of Israel in the way Jesus tells it and enacts it. They would find that very attractive because these peasants don't lose any love on their rulers either.
Mm.
So the Jesus is against the rulers and is revitalizing peasant villages would be very attractive to other peasants. And that would be one of the reasons why I think the movement spread, not the way we were taught in theological school, but started spreading from village to village to village. By the way, one more thing that was new to me, this was from some classic scholars who did some work on languages. And in Syria, north and east of Galilee, villages were bilingual. They still spoke Aramaic, but they also spoke Greek. Let's put a whole different light on how this movement might have spread, because villages that are bilingual, they don't have to translate things. They can tell the story to some people in Greek and tell the same story to other people in Aramaic. So in any case, the question of identity is also a matter of particular context and who are your friends and who you're over against. And in this case, this would play a role then in the Jesus movement and the different branches of the Jesus movement.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, give us another one.
What are the deeply symbolic terms that are used to refer to Jesus by his followers regarding his engagement with a renewal of Israel and his fulfillment of Israel's hopes?
Tom, you go ahead and speak, especially to John, and I want to come back on that one from some of the other.
The ones that I'm trying to think and narrowing it to that. I mean, obviously the ones that came to my mind, the deeply symbolic terms. Okay, so obviously you have terms like he's referred to as the Christ or the Anointed One. And for John, that's a meaningful term because at the end in 2031, he says he wants you to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Anointed One, and have life in his name. The one that first came to my mind, Dick, in that is this king language that's used of Jesus, not as much by Jesus, but of him throughout the gospel, where he's attested as a king, oftentimes by other people, or perceived that way. But I don't know if you would think that would tie into some of the early things about the fulfillment of Israel. So what I was thinking about that immediately was that king language ties into this larger thing that goes back to what we said before, man, that one of the striking characteristics of Jesus in the Gospel of John is his absolute control over everything that happens to himself and everybody else.
Yeah.
Not just from like a son of God perspective, but kind of the way that a person, I view the fourth evangelist as coming from a more marginalized community in his own experience, that he's probably experienced the ban or excommunication or something like that, in a way that a person like that would fantasize that Jesus could do. Like the chief priest can never stop him. The Pilate can't stop him. He says to disciples before he goes to be arrested, "I've conquered the world." in the past tense. And I would see that kind of, but Dick, I don't know if it's fair to say that really ties into a renewal of Israel theme. I mean, the kingship of Jesus and his absolute control and authority over every competing form of power. Of course, that's ironically disrupted in what happens in the story of the, but even in the cross, in the death story of Jesus and John, nobody kills him. He just decides to stop living and gives up his spirit and goes away for a while and then comes back. I that's the one that immediately came to my mind is the anointed one and then the king that he's attested. And then terms like savior of the world, which are, imperial titles, things like that. But do you see that tied to the renewal of Israel theme, Dick, as well?
Yeah, yeah,
Or like,
yeah. This is a good question because of the way we've traditionally learned Jesus as the fulfillment of all of these titles and hopes and expectations. John, the Gospel of John, is amazing for trying to include all of these titles and all of these key aspects of Israelite tradition. And in the first chapter of John, it's as many of the titles as the narrator can work in, including the Son of Man, certainly prophet, Messiah,
God, all this stuff. Yeah, everything.
And then concluding that the primary title is Messiah. But now let's throw in some of these dialogues in John. The way I hear those dialogues is what the story is doing is hooking in with, let's say, the resurrection and the life that comes up because of Lazarus, the resurrection and the life. And then the punchline is, oh, that's me, says Jesus. I am the resurrection and the life. So there's other examples of these key, deeply symbolic things. Now let's shift to the other gospels. And now here's where we throw a monkey wrench into the way we were all taught. It's remarkable, and I was mentioning this a while back. In the Gospel of Mark, for example, even as Jesus admonished Peter for having said that he's the Messiah. No, he's got to go die on the cross. That's not the Messiah. Nor is that one of the popular prophets that I've written about way back. Those are kings of local movements. Jesus isn't one of those either. Now, let's pause a minute to look at this question of the Messiah and King. Something that happened when I was in graduate school in a seminar that was led by Christopher Stendhal is we were beginning to be suspicious of that title Messiah. Part of the education in theological school was to teach us to show on the basis of Old Testament texts that Jesus was the fulfillment of the expectations of the Messiah, Jewish expectations of the Messiah. Well, Stendhal had us look for occurrences of the Messiah, that term, Mashiach in Hebrew, Christos in Greek, and so forth, in all of the literature more or less contemporary with Jesus. It ain't there. There's maybe a couple instances. One of them is the Psalm of Solomon 17. And then there were a couple of conferences, one of a bunch of Jewish scholars and one at Princeton of all sorts of Christian scholars. And the assignment was to check on the different terms Messiah. And we came up more or less empty. It's not prominent. Now let's go to Matthew and Luke as well. There, it's more or less a prophet. Jesus acts and speaks as a prophet through the mission of Jesus in Galilee. Matthew and Luke, though, have the beginning in the infancy narrative, the first three chapters. There, Jesus is born as the Messiah, and although not as strong in the rest of the gospel, sort of is a Messiah at the end of the Gospels. this is something that we have yet to get our heads around in New Testament scholarship, that the Messiah is not as strong as we thought. And Jesus, if you had to pick a role that Jesus is playing and that the historical Jesus is playing, it's a prophet like Moses and,
Yeah.
and Elijah, and then in speaking like Jeremiah or Amos or so forth. It's very much building on the Israelite tradition, a prophet role. And of course, that's very clear in Q, in those speeches.
And even John has some of that Elijah stuff, so raising dead people,
Yeah,
feeding
yeah, yeah,
people. There's the healing type stuff. All that stuff's going on there. Yes.
yeah.
How do the Gospels portray the Samaritans? Are they consistent with one another, or are there differences in their respective treatments of them?
And Tom, you go ahead since you've already pointed out that it's only in John.
Well, yeah, the main thing I would, I don't know if this is the right way to say it though, sir, like that is it right to say that John's gospel is more inclusive regarding them, right? Because is that right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I know less about what's going on in Mark. It just strikes me that in John's gospel, John the Baptist is active, and I think Aenon near Salim is probably up the river there toward the Samaritan side. So, why I'm saying that. You may disagree with that, but then the story of the Samaritan woman is a very distinctive, very memorable story. It's very unique to all of that too. So, um, they they portray, and of course, there's a theory. Raymond Brown had the theory, so you remember that there was a Samaritan contingent in Johannine Christianity, and that's why there was it was a more positive presentation. That these are people who are genuinely in John's gospel. Jacob is the one where you have this Samaritan woman, and then the whole village comes out and says he's the savior of the
Yeah.
world, and they love him, and he goes on his way, and they're telling all their friends about Jesus and this cool thing that happened. And you don't have like the Galileans, the calling down fire on the Samaritan villages and things like this that you have in the others. It's just there's not a great deal of, that's why when you're asked about it, it's different. I guess the difference would be there's a more hopeful posture in John, and is there a greater openness on Jesus' part too, Dick? Do you think on Jesus' part toward them in John
Yeah.
than what you would see in the others?
We should mention that in Matthew,
Yeah,
Matthew says to the disciples, "Go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel."
yeah, he don't like them.
The next thing out of his mouth is, "Don't go to the Samaritans."
He forbids them from doing it,
So
right?
that's a rather disturbing, thing when it comes to wait a minute, isn't this a renewal of Israel all inclusive? So there are some problems here in the synoptic tradition.
But in John's approach to it, and this is where I think you actually see this is what the way we got working on this book, Jacob, was was really heavily influenced by Professor Horsley's work on social science criticism of Roman Palestine. And then I was coming up from the Johannine side. So when I was looking at this going and media criticism stuff too, and I was like, a lot of what he was talking about theoretically in Mark and Q, I could see even more clearly in John.
Yeah, yeah,
And that I would think that, right, this is one example of it. Like for John, the renewal of Israel, like bringing back whatever was theoretically there, even though it probably never really was. It's all of it. It means all of us. It means you people down here, you people over here, and these people up here. And he's really envisioning, right, this I don't know if the tribes is the right word, but like the three sectors all coming back together somehow under something. But the only way you're going to do that is to break some of that great tradition, that system that is pushing that apart, and that ain't going to happen, obviously, in the way the story ends, right? The forces that are keeping that division in place apparently prevail, although obviously the idea is that you can have this renewal and unification happen another way.
Jacob, we should point out that uh, the 12 tribes, no one remembered at the time of Jesus, that which tribes were where, except that Judea was the place where the tribe of Judah had been, and that it was known that Benjamin was part of that. Benjamin was included there. But it wasn't as though um, people remembered uh, uh, the 12 tribes as particular to always to a particular area. No, it was the 12 was symbolic of all Israel. And then what happened in the Jesus movement, or movements, maybe plural, was they developed differently. And of course, part of the difference was whether was who all was included in the community that then developed. And apparently in the Matthean, it did not include the Samaritans. In Johannine, looks like it did.
Yeah.
How does Jesus fulfill the role of the Anointed One and the King of Israel? And what does the Samaritan woman say in John about Jesus?
Wow. How does he fulfill that role?
This is really more John than anything. No, go ahead.
No, I'm thinking the only thing, because we've talked about some of this already. How he fulfills the role of the Anointed One, Dick. I don't even really know how to approach that part, because it's often said, Jacob, that in John's gospel, the word Anointed One, the Messiah or the Christ, is so tied to his total presentation that it almost is its own source. You know what I mean? For that, because like Dick said, this isn't a super common term. It's one that is kind of being defined by what Jesus is doing in that, especially in that book. I think the King of Israel part, though, what strikes me about your question is when that comes up, it's sometimes tied to like the story of the feeding, where they want to make him king. Dick,
yeah.
it's portrayed in context where he is, well, the first one is in the very beginning of the book when you don't know why they think he's this. It's like Nathaniel saying this. He's like, why are you calling me that? Because I haven't done anything yet. Later on, though, it seems like it is tied to him doing things that would speak to provision or deliverance for the people. Is that fair to say? Like that one is the one that immediately came to my
I think at the time we get the Johannine story, the John story that we have,
right.
The Messiah was already a standard title for the figure that was going to carry out the renewal of Israel. So Messiah and other titles are, as I said in first chapter, are thrown at Jesus by different disciples. Now, in chapter wherever it is that Jesus does the feeding, it's a very brief reference. The people wanted to come and take him and make him king by force.
Yep.
So there, it's like he's being drafted by people to be their king, and that fits more the popular movements that Josephus describes, but it doesn't register as something that's significant in John, I don't think. Now at the end, well, from the point of chapter 11, 12, so forth, there Jesus is the Messiah, but it's a very peculiar kind of Messiah because it's a Messiah who's hung on a cross, this is very, very different from any sort of expectations. So all of this is something that's being worked out in the Johannine community in the course of telling this story. Now, in the other Gospels, well, not in Q, but in Mark, Matthew, so forth, there is an anointing going on in Jerusalem just before the Last Supper, and there I've forgotten which whether it's in Mark or Matthew. It's very explicit. He's being anointed for burial. Oh, by the way, we could see there's anointing going on in John, but it's an anointing of the feet. It's washing the feet.
Yeah, right. At the end.
But in Mark, Matthew, there's an anointing going on, but it's an anointing for burial. So yes, it's like a prophet anointing the king of Israel, but it's a woman doing the anointing and anointing for burial. So again, it fits the Jesus that's about to get crucified. And again, it suggests that the Messiah is subdominant to prophet.
Yeah, I mean, you do have the reference in where the crowds are talking there in John 7, and they're saying to each
Yeah,
other, "Well, is the anointed one going to do more signs than this guy is?"
yeah, good.
Which is that prophetic connection, and you have,
Uh,
but then they come back at him. They come back amongst themselves, like, well, the anointed one doesn't come from
yeah,
Galilee, right?
yeah.
So, which I don't even know exactly where that's coming from. Yeah,
And
it's
that's the Pharisees. That's the elite saying that. In
right.
our scripture, it doesn't come from Galilee.
He has to come from down here, and John doesn't have a Christmas story where Jesus is from
Yeah,
Bethlehem. He looks like he's from up there around, you know, Cana, Nazareth, someplace like that. In that there, and they want him to tell them plainly, "Are you the Messiah?" And he's like, "Well, he never tells them anything plainly in the Gospel of John, so
yeah,
he's not going to tell them that.
yeah,
It's never going to come around to that being that clear."
yeah. Jacob, go.
How how deep in Israelite tradition is the opposition
Wow.
to Jerusalem's rulers?
Which Israelite tradition, right, man? The one
You
up in
get,
the north is pretty deep.
yeah,
Go back to the
this is
go back to the
this is
beginning.
pretty deep, and we should back right up into the Hebrew Bible. Um, I already mentioned this briefly, but um, uh, um, on the one hand, Jerusalem is the capital. Jerusalem is the seat of the government of the head of states, whether it's King David or Rehoboam or or Josiah, or then the high priests in the Second Temple period. Um, um, Now, on the other hand, the the Israelites are out in the country. They're villagers in early Israel as well. And no sooner does David get anointed as the Messiah and set himself up as king in Jerusalem, then the Israelites rebel. And they rebel three times, and the last time being led by Jeroboam against the forced labor. Now, the whole Old Testament, you could say, the whole Hebrew Bible is a story of this opposition. And the prophets, of course, in the north, they're against the rulers in Bethel. But in the south, they're against the rulers in Jerusalem. It's Isaiah, Micah, and and Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah, he prophesies against the king building a new palace and so forth. And then Jeremiah takes the opposition and the prophecies right into the temple in chapter 7 and chapter 26, where he's indicting the high priests for not just violating particular commandments, but they've violated the whole covenant. So, Jacob, you could say that the Mosaic covenant is the binding that holds Israel together, especially the villages and the tribes. But the Mosaic covenant also says there should be no human king. And to violate that and to adjust to that, the prophet Samuel is asked by Israel to give us a king. And he tries to persuade them, don't do it because the king will oppress you. And they says, no, give us a king. So man, Samuel gives a speech that is an adapted covenant. And then Samuel provides a new covenant, which is God's promise to David that there will always be a ruler, always be a son of David on the throne. Now, you could say that the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is a story of that conflict. And this just continues in Second Temple times. The people rebel against the Hasmoneans. They rebel against King Herod. The rebellion happens just after Herod dies. and then they continue to resist the high priest under the Roman Empire. So I would say, and this impression in my mind is growing, that the opposition is fundamental, and that we ought to face up to that in how we research and write and understand this. That there's conflict going on here, and the conflict a part of the story.
Yeah, probably so, right, in ratio to the extent to which, and that's in the prophetic traditions, you're getting that opposition, right? The ratio to which the person expressing opposition has a stake in that that opposite, like you've pointed out so many times, so many, Jacob, going, it's not just going back into the centuries before Jesus, like around Jesus' time, there are so many prophetic oppositional movements that come up that are opposed to the whole, not just to the Romans, right, Dick, but to the whole system over there, that we have to go out in the wilderness or over here and do this, and we're going to fight against it in a holy war type of mentality that's driven by God's going to start doing signs and wonders again, right? And call us all back and bring us all back together and get this out of here, whatever that would. And you see that mentality even in the Qumran community, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the scribal thinking that type of thing is going to, in a different way of opposing that in that sense too, right?
Very interesting that the Qumran community, now these are our intellectual elite. These are the priests and scribes, and they're disgusted that the Hasmoneans set up what they figured to be a phony upstart high priesthood. They want to get back to the good old days when it was the Zadokites and running thing. But what do they resort to? They resort to a covenant. They go to the covenantal tradition that is where they identify against the high priests in Jerusalem.
And what they're doing,
Did John the Baptist and Jesus' activities represent an alternative to the temple, acting as a replacement to it?
Oh wow, man.
Hard to say with John the Baptist.
Yeah.
But with Jesus, let's just take the Gospel of Mark. In the first several episodes, you could see that Jesus is doing something that is critical of, or is a replacement for example, sacrifices for sin. Jesus does a healing. At the same time, it's a forgiveness of sins. Now, in John, which is what we're talking mainly about today, right from the beginning, in the first big sign of face off in Jerusalem in chapter 2, Jesus is an alternative to the temple. Don't you think, Tom, that Jesus in his own body representing
and John's comment on it, sure.
And the Jesus' body is also the body of Israel, Jesus' symbolic body. Jesus is very much an alternative, or the movement that Jesus is catalyzing, is generating. And that comes to climax then in chapter 11 and 12 in John, where Jesus has recruited so many people for this movement that the high priests worry, whoa, they're all going after him, and the Romans are going to come and take charge and going to get rid of the temple.
Yeah, it's the way you asked the question, Jacob, is what really makes it a good question, man. It's, you're saying, do John the Baptist and Jesus' activities, are they an alternative to the temple? And obviously, like, well, the first thing I thought of, obviously, too, John is the fourth gospel is the one that has John the Baptist down in near Bethany beyond Jordan, which I think is where they thought the spot was that Joshua came across to conquer so right out of the box, you're already in a symbolic universe where something's going to change with what those people are doing up there, and the whole renewal of Israel thing and restoring the covenant. And then but as an alternative, I guess the reason I'm a little hesitant is like if and I don't know if I'm really even hesitant thinking about this. When you asked that question, Jacob, I was thinking, well, you mean an alternative like he replaced or they were trying to replace the sacrificial system? So like Jesus' death somehow replaces the need for that. That's way less pronounced in the Gospel of John than it is in the other ones, even though he has him dying at on the day of preparation for the Passover.
Like,
And he does have him feeding 5,000 people at the time of the Passover, up in Galilee instead. He didn't go down for
yeah,
that
yeah.
one. I don't know if he would be an alternative. So it's maybe a
I
question,
think,
alternative in what sense,
yeah,
right?
it's not a replacement for the sacrificial system. It's that, maybe that opposition I'm playing with before.
Yeah,
It's the Mosaic covenant uh, is the way is what holds Israel together, and is what is
as a
fundamental to
yeah,
Israel. And the temple came later, and the temple is problematic, and the sacrificial system is problematic. And the
right.
people who want to keep that going are the high priests and the priests who depend upon it. Um, and so I think we're um, Christianity then saw itself with the sacrifice of Jesus, so forth, as the replacement for the sacrificial system of Judaism. But that's not what's going on in the Gospels, and that's not what's going on in these movements. Um, um, we've got to think about it in different terms, and I suggest that the terms to think about it in is that Mosaic covenant and the renewal of Israel is,
Yeah.
is focused in, built on the renewal of the covenant, and there Jesus is in a prophetic role. Now, I think we can explain where the Messiah role came from. Uh, I don't know if you want to go into that because I don't think that fits John, but we can talk about that some other time.
I think, to what you're saying right now, sir, and Jacob, you've asked several questions about the Samaritans, which is insightful because this is kind of a unique problem in the fourth gospel. We don't see any other ones. But like the alternative to the temple thing, in one sense, it would be an alternative for sure. In that, I'm thinking back, Dick, to the story of this woman at Sychar, the Samaritan woman again.
Yeah,
And that's where in that story, it's explicitly the explicit difference between the dividing point between the Samaritan traditions and the Samaritan people and the Judeans is you people say our fathers worshipped on this mountain. And by the way, when she says our fathers, she means yours and ours, because Abraham was ours and Jacob was ours.
yeah,
Okay. You people did this other thing over here. So you people say Jerusalem is the place we have to go to worship. So it sets up this dichotomy between are we supposed to focus on this place here or that place over there? Like, do I worship in Shechem or in Gerizim or in Jerusalem? And he says, well, actually, you're supposed to worship in spirit and in truth, which just
yeah,
blows up the whole thing. Like, it doesn't make any difference either way. So once you take that out of the way, then the barrier to that renewal where the Samaritan people would come back is kind of removed, right?
yeah. Jacob, this Tom maybe just answered the question with the most important passage. Um, Jesus says, neither in
Neither one.
spirit and in truth. That's what we want. And that is an alternative to both, alternative to the one that's been destroyed, and an alternative to Jerusalem. Um, um, I don't know. I'm just guessing that this is the way to read the Gospel of John.
And it's the one that's the most inclusive because
Yeah,
once you
yeah,
take
yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
so maybe an alternative in that sense for sure. Yeah. I love that question, man. That was well, well
Uh,
said.
Jacob, let me interrupt to ask, how much longer will we go on? Because
Just
I
one
would.
last question
Okay,
left.
let's do it, bro. Yeah.
Okay, let's go. Yeah,
So for my final question, when looking at all of the data, the
yeah.
four Gospels and Qumran over text, what do their commonalities and differences tell us about Jesus regarding the conflicts between the Israelites, the Samaritans, and Northern Israelites in general? In other words, What conclusion did you both come to?
Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I'll tell you what, man, and this is gonna reflect my own just outlook on life in some ways, which is also something I picked up from Dick. Although he's not responsible for what I say is stupid. Um, the commonalities and differences. So I'll just put it like this. I have often wondered, and looking back at this, because we read these texts as they're theological texts, they're in the Bible, right? And so it's easy to assume that the differences between Galileans and Samaritans and Judeans, all that, are religious theological differences, and I'm sure there were. But there's also this other layer through all of, okay, this is a long answer to your question. There's this other layer along all of this that has to do with money and power. Okay. And I've often wondered, if some, I don't know how to say this other than this, if some of those conflicts that you would see that would exist at the, as is often the case in modern societies, where the conflicts between people who are in less privileged socioeconomic classes are manufactured by people up the chain because it sort of suits their own purposes. Because if I'm living in Sychar or Shechem or a Judean village or up in Gamala and Galilee or whatever, I'm not a person who's reading the Bible because I probably can't read anything. Like my worldview is being shaped by popular traditions, by purity codes, if I'm going to follow them, by stories I've heard or I hear at synagogue or just hear my mom told me about what King David did and things like that. And so I wonder if I actually wonder if a lot of those differences are amplified in the scribal tradition, Dick, where you have these real sharp delineations made between this place and this place and this place. Because all the way back, this goes to another question I earlier, all the way back, um, this notion that's sometimes portrayed in the Hebrew Bible narratives that the Samaritans are impure because they're basically a bunch of Baalistic whatever, and they have different worship places. It's clear all the way back that there was always this intermingling at a popular level, even in the temple. Even Josephus says, man, all of the memorial gifts that all the pagans had put in the temple there to nail up to the wall. It was like because God cured my hemorrhage or something like that. So
Yeah.
I guess I think that what you see when you look at all of them, it's a very complex interface between differing ideas. I just often wonder, man, if the common people of all three really understood what necessarily those differences were or what they were rooted in. You know what I mean? Dick, I don't know if that's what how you would look at that or not. There's
Well,
obviously a very clear distinction in the top elite level as to why we're different from you and why you people are not allowed to come over here and we're not going to go over there. But I don't know if that was if you see that as prominent when you get down to, or what was driving that from a lower level when people who can't read any of this stuff anyway, what it would mean to them.
yeah. Um, I the longer I'm working at this material, these Gospels, the the context through Josephus and other sources, the more I see um, this fundamental conflict, this fundamental divide between the rulers and the ruled. And then with regard to the ruled, especially the Israelite peoples, I see historical differences that we've already talked about. That Judea, we know that story best because we read the biblical books, and we know that then the Persians put the Jerusalem temple in place, and the subsequent empires kept the temple in place, and then we know about the Hasmoneans, and we know about Herod, and so forth and so on. What we don't know so much about are Samaria, although we know a little bit more about Samaria, and Galilee, the Transjordan, and then other peoples in the perimeter. Now, all of those peoples and the other peoples in the perimeter were were conquered at one point by the Hasmonean high priests.
Mhm.
And then, of course, the Romans came in and conquered everybody. So there's a clear divide between the Romans and the local rulers on the one hand, and the people, especially the villagers, on the other. Now, what happened, I think, in Jesus' mission and then the development of Jesus' movement and branches of the Jesus movement were, they used to say, from the foot of the cross. I don't know that it's from the foot of the cross, but it's certainly within the first generation or so. There were local, what I wouldn't call them divisions, but local branches of Jesus movements.
Yeah.
And these continued to develop in some connection with each other and to develop independently. We know about the one that was centered in Jerusalem best because of the book of Acts. And that tells a story that doesn't wash at all, because the movement in Judea was supposedly developed from the disciples who came from Jerusalem to start that movement. No, we know that things happen from the ground up much more than from the top down. So when we then have these different gospels and Q, which I'm pretty sure that we can sort of sort that out from Matthew and Luke, then we have 4 stories plus these speeches that tell basically the same story with variations. And I see that every one of those as being continuous with the history and the tradition of Israel. They're not Gentile primarily, they're Israelite movements, and every one of these gospels is about the fulfillment of Israel in these movements, in the Jesus movement and these movements still continuing. So they're all Israelite movements, but they have these variations then, and we can appreciate how those all are drawing on Israelite tradition. And then let me just come back around to the more we work with this material, I think it's clear that there was an Israelite popular tradition that was different from the scribal tradition, which is primarily Judean. We have to call that Judean scribal tradition. The Israelite tradition was broader and a little bit more diverse. And the trouble is we don't have sources for this. They're just indirect sources, which are the ones we have from the scribes, the people who could write. So we're sort of at a new beginning point once we discover these communications differences. Once we discover that everything was oral and there was performance and so forth, and we're only beginning to see the commonalities and the differences in these. And for those, we need to keep working at the different gospels. And the new kid on the block is the Gospel of John, which we're only beginning to work on. And I think that Tom and I have one of the better handles on that.
We'll see.
Thanks to you, Tom.
Yeah.
We've got a pretty good handle on that for what we're going to find going forward.
I'll take that, man. Thank you, sir.
And before we close, I'd like to remind everybody real quick that the link to purchase John, Jesus, and the Renewal of Israel will be in the description below in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Dick and Tom, thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jake. I really, seriously,
Thank
man,
you,
love your
Jacob.
channel and how you're really bringing serious stuff to people's attention, and you do really thoughtful readings of everything, and I just love this stuff. So watch his other stuff; it's really good.
And Jacob, you can tell that this was a lot of fun for Tom and me to come back
Love
together.
it, man. Hardly ever, nobody cares this much about this stuff except you and the
So
people.
thanks for catalyzing this.
Thanks for the opportunity, man.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much again.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during the live stream. Thank you.